Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. We are now through Game 2 of the NBA Finals. With that being said, Game 3 will take place on Wednesday, June 7th, meaning that we'll be able to live stream our reaction and recap of that game. And our live streams are pretty fun, interactive normally. If you guys are in the chat, you guys kind of make or break it. So please show up, please show out. Helps us out a lot. And before we really get started with today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at the OBT Podcast.
And also, just as a special reminder, so for next week's regular episode, that is Thursday, we're going to actually have a guest. And now we've had guests before on this podcast, but this time we actually are having an NBA player, right? So, former NBA player, as well as a star of the Philippines league right now, KJ McDaniels. So just be tuned for that next week on Thursday. And now I guess to segue into our first topic, we have game 2 of the NBA Finals. We got the Denver Nuggets losing, right? Miami Heat winning 111-108 to tie up the series. This was kind of a game where we talked about it in game 1, where we were kind of concerned with the way that Miami looked in game 1 in the sense where like it didn't feel like that they necessarily played bad,
Sure.
but it just more so felt like Denver was better. But in game 2, give credit to them. They made a lot of adjustments. Some of these things were things we talked about going into the series. For example, one of them was the biggest change was the starting lineup,
Yeah.
putting Kevin Love in there as opposed to Caleb Martin. This was something where after the series ended, we talked about, should Kevin Love be back in the rotation? And I think both you and I both thought he should play. I don't know if we were necessarily both like on the line if he should start. I mean, personally, I think we both were for the most part.
Yeah.
Um, but definitely we were. I was very surprised that he didn't play at all in game 1. I do say, or at the very least, I do think in general, I think it's pretty common for coaches to kind of go into the next series with the lineup that got them there, right? Because
Yes.
like we saw the Lakers in game 1, right? Dennis Schroeder was inserted into the starting lineup in that closeout game 6 against Golden State. He starts in game 1 against Denver, right? And then similar here, right? They go with that same starting five Miami did in game 1, right? That they used to beat Boston in game 7, right? With Caleb Martin starting. And then they took him out. And it was actually kind of interesting, right? Because he was one of their best players in the previous series and for a decent chunk of these playoffs. But, in this game, he didn't really do much of anything. But, we'll start off obviously with the big guys, right?
Yeah.
Most of the starters, right? As we mentioned, Kevin Love, who started, right? Not a huge scoring game, right? But 6 points, grabbed 10 rebounds, 2 steals, an assist, 2 of 6 from three. Um, when he was out there, the Heat were definitely better.
Yeah.
I would say for the most part, like significantly, and I think a lot of the stats show that, even if his personal numbers don't necessarily reflect it. And then after that, you got a pretty balanced attack from the rest of the starters.
Yes.
Um, Bam Adebayo with 21 points, 4 assists, 9 rebounds, 5 of 5 from the free throw line, some big free throws down the stretch. 8 of 14. Didn't settle for as many jump shots, which I thought was key.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Jimmy Butler, 21 points, 9 assists, 4 rebounds, 2 of 5 from three, 7 of 19. Didn't really have a great game, I thought, at least offensively, until the fourth quarter. I
I
thought he
agree.
for the whole game did a great job of guarding Jamal Murray, and that was kind of what helped Miami with the insertion of Kevin Love. Was it allowed Love to kind of stay on Gordon, and then it allowed Jimmy Butler to be on Jamal Murray and kind of make him, to me, for most of the game, a non-factor, right? I think
Yeah.
Jamal Murray finished with like 18 and 10, but some of those points to me were like when the game was kind of over. I know Denver made the comeback and had a chance to tie it. I didn't think they were coming back
Right.
to win it. Even though again, they made that push. But Max Strus started off the game with a big first half, especially in that first quarter. 14.6 assists, 4 of 10 from three. Gabe Vincent was huge, 23 points to lead. I guess, to lead Miami in scoring, 23 points,
Mm-hmm.
2 steals, 3 assists. No rebounds, right? But again, doesn't really matter. You got other guys that can get rebounds. 4 of 6 from three, 8 of 12. Um, and then Duncan Robinson, another hero, no pun intended, to come off the bench. Points, 2 of 3 from three, most of them in the fourth quarter,
Yeah.
uh, which was huge to get Miami back into the game because they were actually trailing to start the fourth quarter. And then Kyle Lowry also with some big moments off the bench, some big shots, 9 points, 3 assists. So overall, just a really balanced attack from Miami. Also, a complete flip of that 3-point shooting. where they were
Yes.
terrible from where they were terrible from three for most of the game in game one, other than the fourth quarter. But they were pretty consistent from three this game, right? They shot 48.5% from three, 17 of 35. Also got to the line a lot more, 18 of 20, right? So that was the big difference there, being able to get to the line while also shooting the ball really well. And just getting everybody involved, right? Because we know, like, if Jimmy Butler isn't going to have like a 30+ point game, then this is the type of game where you got to have everybody step up.
Yes,
And
sir.
Miami got that, right? I mean, because again, like all of these baskets were all much needed baskets, um, right? And just guys that could get it done on both ends, and that's important, right? Because again, Miami talent wise, I think is lacking compared to Denver. So you need to have guys that can step up in big moments, make a lot of hustle plays, hit big shots, right? Make smart passes. Because the fourth quarter was where Miami really, really got going because they had an early big lead in the first quarter.
Yeah.
I think they were up 11 at one point, and then Denver just, with the shot making, they were hot from three early on, so they were able to get back into the game. And then a swing point in the game was when Jokic was off the floor for a good chunk of the second quarter, and Denver expanded the lead, right? Like they were, I think it was a pretty close game. I think they were down by three to start the second quarter, and Denver just, took off. They were getting stops. They were getting out in transition. Jeff
Hmm.
Green was hitting. Well, he got to the line and also hit a big three. Christian Brown gave them some good minutes. So they won the non-Jokic minutes in the first half, but they lost it in the fourth, right? Because they lost pretty much the whole lead when Jokic was off the floor to start the fourth. And
Yeah.
if we look at Denver's box score, right, Jokic, right, led the team in scoring, 41 points, 11 rebounds, 4 assists, 2 of 5 from three, 7 of 8 from the line, right? So obviously this was one of his best games. 5 turnovers though, which isn't great compared to 4 assists, but I thought for the most part, right, like he was pretty much the main reason why Denver was in the game in the second half,
Yes.
right? Because you didn't get enough from other guys. In terms of the starters, right? Because I thought Denver's bench played pretty well in the first half,
Sure.
more than you would have expected. But the starters to me just didn't get it done. Aaron Gordon was okay, right? But definitely not the same impact that he had in game one. And I think part of that was Kevin Love. Even though he's not really looked at as a defender, just having another bigger guy out there that can be physical, I think helps. Michael Porter Jr., I thought he was awful
Yeah, he
on both
stunk it up.
ends of the floor, right? Yeah, 5 points, 6 rebounds, 2 of 8 from the field, 1 of 6 from three. A lot of really ill-advised, poor shots, right? Contested shots over guys. And again, like he was hitting those shots at different points in the playoffs, right? But they were not falling in this game. And you can't do that and also be bad on defense.
Right.
Jamal Murray, the counting stats don't look too bad, 18 and 10, but I thought some of that was kind of inflated by the shots that he made late in the game when I thought the game was over.
Hmm.
I thought Miami pretty much neutralized him pretty much from the tip. Just in terms of Jimmy Butler, right, being able to be physical and that zone defense taking away, the pick and roll two-man Jokic Murray game, right? It kind of forced Jokic into pretty much going one-on-one for most of the game, right? He only had 4 assists. Um, right, and it's not like he wasn't passing the ball. It was just, again, it was kind of the game plan. It seemed like was, he was going one-on-one and they were taking away everyone else, right?
Right.
Caldwell Pope, right? I thought had a pretty poor game. 6 points, 3 assists, but 6 fouls. A lot of really poor fouls. I thought. I think he
Yeah.
he had that one foul in the fourth quarter where he fouled Kyle Lowry on the three.
Yes.
And I just thought like just some of these decisions were just really poor.
That was undisciplined.
Yeah, exactly. Because again, you had a. I mean, that happened multiple times in this game where guys were just fouling guys on threes, and
Yeah.
I think yeah, because he fouled Max Strus. I think, or was it Jamal Murray? One of them fouled Max Strus.
Yeah. But
The
Struess
first
definitely
half.
got fouled.
Exactly. And it's just like those are just and again, those are just poor decisions, right? And I know some people will point to some bad missed calls, but I don't think Denver lost because of the officiating. I just
Mm-mm.
from the jump, it felt like they were, to me not as disciplined, particularly on the defensive end.
Yeah.
I thought Miami again came out with a great amount of desperation, but to Denver's credit, they battled back and took a big lead. I think they were up by as much as 15 at one point. Um, Right, but Miami kept hanging around, kept making it a really close game, and it just felt like, okay, this is going to go one of two ways. Either Miami's going to pull it out, right, or Denver's going to, keep the lead, right? But like I said, the turning point, they lost the non-Jokic minutes when they won those minutes in the second quarter, and Miami was just again like just pinpoint on their execution, right? Like Kyle Lowry running the pick and roll,
Yeah.
right? Jimmy Butler. right? Running the two-man game with Bam, even Duncan Robinson getting off of the dribble handoffs, right? I think he had that one play also that was kind of surprising, right, where he drove. I think he drove and drove to the basket and laid it in against Jeff Green,
Yeah.
right? You could see Jamal Murray was also getting picked on defensively. Um, but again, like for Miami, this is kind of their key to win is you need contributions from other guys. Your jump shooting has to be on point, right? You got to figure out ways to get to the line because again, like Denver is not a team that should be able to keep you away from the free throw line. I get
Right.
that their defense hasn't been bad necessarily, right? But still, like you have guys in Butler that in Jimmy Butler and Bam that can get to the line, right? They
Yes.
can play downhill, they can be aggressive on offense, and again, they were right. I mean, again, 5 free throw attempts for each one doesn't seem like a lot, right? But they only had 2 free throws, in game one, right? And like this is a big deal. I mean, this is the first time this entire playoffs that Denver lost at home, right? So Miami has definitely made this a series now. I'm not saying that they're gonna win it, right? But obviously, like they've made it a series now when I think a lot of people wrote them off after game one. Because again, you needed to win one of these first 2 games to have a chance
Hmm.
at winning the series, right? And now you go back to Miami with the series tied, and you could potentially get Tyler Hero back for game three, right? This is like kind of best case scenario, I think, for Miami, right? Because again, you weren't going to win both in Denver. You just needed to win one. So now you go back home and you have a chance, to take a lead in the series. Again, we'll have to see what happens, right? Because Denver, I suppose, can also make some other adjustments too. And again, you would think some of their other key guys should be better.
Right.
Um, but again, like, just considering the way that it went, right? Like it just Denver all postseason long for the most part has been the best team late in games, down the stretch, right? But this time they were not, right? And because again, I was pretty surprised, just to see Miami, like I said, continuing to hang around because it just felt like they were just getting blitzed in that second quarter. But
Sure.
again, you got to give major props to Miami because they've been really good in the playoffs all year, right? Battling back from big deficits and pulling off wins, right? That's how they beat Milwaukee, right? Because they had back to back, right, series clinching wins where they were down by double digits going into the fourth. And again, just everybody contributed, right? Because again, it wasn't you didn't even have like a huge Jimmy Butler game. He had a great fourth, right? The last missed shot notwithstanding, but either way, right? Like this is the way that you have a chance to win. You gotta be on point, right? Because again, when you make mistakes, Denver's going to punish you, right?
Yes.
Every time Miami was making mistakes in the first half, right, Denver would get out and run and either knock down threes or score in transition, and get to the basket. Like it was rough, but they cleaned it up, right? That shooting held on because we talked about even in game one, they got a lot of good looks. They just weren't falling, and
Yes.
sometimes it kind of is a make or miss league, even though like it kind of is at times frustrating, to talk about it in those simple of terms, but sometimes that's all it um is just can you make shots like in big moments, and this time Miami did it, um whereas Denver did not. And like I said, I continue to say this is a big deal because Denver has not lost a single game at home
Yeah.
in the playoffs up until this point, even with all the other teams they faced. They faced Minnesota in the first round, then Phoenix in the second round, Lakers in the conference finals, and again, this is the first team to hang an L on them at home. That's a big deal. Miami has a better chance now. I'm not saying that they are going to win the series because I still do feel like Denver's the better team,
Hmm.
but this is the best you could hope for if you're Miami going back to Denver with the series tied. It just kind of depends on like with Denver. I think they, again, it didn't feel like the defense was focused at different points because you had a number of guys that I just thought were really careless defensively. Like I said, Michael Porter Jr., Caldwell
Yes.
Pope,
Yep.
and these were guys who I thought defensively played well in game one. So they got to be better. And again, that's kind of the key for Denver. It's a similar thing. Can you get enough guys to contribute? Because we know Jokic is going to play well pretty much every game. He's their best player. And Miami doesn't really have a single guy that can necessarily stop him. Um, but if you can take out the other guys, right, which they did with Jamal Murray, which they did with Michael Porter Jr. and other guys, right, like that's the key to win.
Yeah. And for me, I feel like the big deal is definitely the split. Getting the split is a huge deal, especially against a team that, has not lost at home up until now. So, the Lakers couldn't get the split and look at what happened to them. So, Miami definitely has a better chance, I think, than, before game one or after game one, excuse me. So, now that game two has happened and they have the split, it's a big deal. And, my takeaways, I think this was definitely a more exciting game overall than the first game, for sure. Even though there were some points where, like you said, you thought Miami was absolutely done for due to the fact that, the lead was getting bigger and bigger. But man, the Heat just powered back and persevered through that. Bam, I thought he was a huge factor. Mainly on the offensive end. I can't really say defensively too much. I mean, I guess the two blocks does help for sure, but offensively, that's what you need. I feel like Miami collectively, when they play well collectively, it's a really good team. But when one guy is going off and then nobody else does anything, you can't win. So I'm not sure how sustainable this is going to be in a 7-game series. Like I said, I think that the size disadvantage is going to hurt Miami in the long run, because it's only been 2 games. So now, it's kind of 50-50 at this point because that's what it is. But, um, I shout out to Bam 100% because I thought he played. Um, this is the level that you need him to play at, especially considering the pitiful series that he had against Boston. I think I have to go as far to say that he did not play to his full potential in Boston because we know he's a great defensive player and he can and does have potential to be a great offensive player as well if he's aggressive. And getting to the line is key, like you said. In the game one, they barely got to the line. They were very timid, tired, weren't adjusted. But I think they got locked in this game for sure. And then we do have to look at the Nuggets. Jokic had 41, but it's like this was the key and the worry that I had about Denver was their supporting cast. Not in this series particularly, but in the playoffs in general. The question marks were always there. And, Jamal Murray did erase those, but now they've kind of resurfaced alongside Michael Porter Jr. Michael Porter Jr. only having 5 points and 2 for 8 is not sustainable. It's not good. I'm sure he'll bounce back, but, that's definitely one of the big reasons they lost this game, especially since he was a statue on defense and he just was, like you said, undisciplined, didn't look good. And this 18-10 game from Jamal Murray, I still think that's a bad game. I didn't like the final shot. I think they should have called a timeout. I believe they had a
Yep.
timeout. I think they should have game planned a little bit more instead of trusting, I guess the quote unquote hot hand of Jamal Murray because he has been hot throughout the playoffs. But tonight, I just don't think was his night. And on the surface level, sure, that looks like a good game. But I think, if you watch the game and analyze it a little bit deeper, that's a bad game in my opinion. And then, just going down the list, Denver just didn't show up tonight. And that happens. I still think Denver is probably going to win the series, but it may be extended due to this loss because we do know that Miami does have a tendency to, win games under pressure, but especially with their guys like Jimmy Butler and then Hero coming back is a huge deal potentially. I think he could come back game 3, game 4, whenever, but now that they've survived this game, I think him coming back is definitely a big deal because it adds somebody who can create his own shot off the dribble, but also shoot at a phenomenal percentage or, at least a sustainable one. But the problem is he hasn't played in 7 weeks. So we don't know what kind of shape he's going to be coming back on or coming back in. But I mean, overall, I think this is great because this is what the league needed. It's heating up. It's tied 1-1. Big, 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 big deal. Like you said, people are probably not going to talk about it enough, in terms of the split, but that's a big deal narrative wise and game plan going forward for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, I do think this is a big deal that they were able to beat Denver, at home. Again, in a game that was back and forth, right? And,
Sure.
and particularly in a game where Miami was down for most of the game, other than the first quarter, right? They were up in the first quarter, right? But after that, right, they quickly lost that lead and it grew.
Right.
And like you said, that was a great point you made about the final play, which I didn't even mention in my long monologue, I
Yeah.
suppose, where like yeah, like when I was watching it, I was kind of surprised that Denver didn't call a timeout. I understand that like a lot of times, right, like coaches don't always call timeouts when they get the stop because they want to get, a good transition play, right? Because
Sure.
the half court defense isn't set. But
Hmm.
once it became pretty clear, right, that it was just kind of Jamal Murray just kind of dribbling around in no man's land, I
Hmm.
think that's when you have to call a timeout and run a play, right? Because it's not like Denver's half court offense is, bad, right? Because
Right.
usually, like, if you're a team that's not great offensively in the half court, then yeah, it makes a ton of sense to go out and get a transition bucket, right? But when you're in that type of position, I think you have to call a timeout. Like it just because again, the shot that he took to me wasn't a good shot, like you said. It was forced. I thought it had no chance of going in,
Yeah.
and it didn't. Right?
N-
Like they could have gotten a better shot, I think, if they had called a timeout. So,
Yeah.
um, but again, like you said, and like I said to begin when we were talking about the box score, yeah, I think his stats in the box score were kind of inflated because he made those jumpers late,
Hmm.
right? But for most of the game, he was pretty much non-existent,
Exactly.
um, offensively, right? And if he's not giving you, high scoring, right, then you know he's probably not playing very well, right?
I
Because
don't
again,
think he made his. Sorry to cut you off. I don't think he made his first field goal until the second quarter, I believe. So
yeah,
it
because
was
again,
kind of
like
rough.
yeah, because he's been passing well in these playoffs, obviously, right? But again, if he's not giving you a really good offensive performance, right, he's gonna hurt you defensively.
Right.
Because he was getting picked on defensively, as were some other guys, right? But obviously, like in the starting five, he's the weakest link on defense.
Sure.
Right? Because Michael Porter Jr. isn't a good defender, but he's 6'10" and really athletic.
His
So it's more
size
so
masks
like
him.
yeah, exactly. So it's more so like he would be getting lost on defense more so than like, a guy's just taking him off the dribble, and attacking him because, he's doesn't really you know what I mean? Like
Yes.
it's a little bit different, but yeah. But this is kind of what we talked about, when we were constantly talking about other teams in the playoffs, right? Like say the Lakers and some others where, a lot of times when you win, the first game, right? A lot of these games are connected where you win the first game and you kind of naturally take your foot off the gas.
Right.
And Denver did that to start the game, right? Because again, Miami was, like you said, ultra aggressive, focused, and ready. And then Denver made their run and, made it a game and, they took a big lead, but it never got to as big of a lead as it did in game one. Because I think they had gotten that lead up to like as much as like what, 20 plus, I think,
Yeah.
in game one at one point. So like you said, definitely a much better game in game two in terms of like the excitement, right? Because like you said, Miami battled back. And it got close, right? Like Denver had a chance to win the game, obviously, and pull it back. But again, you have to be perfect down the stretch, and Miami was the team that was pretty much perfect down the stretch. I think in the fourth quarter they made almost every shot
Yeah.
that they took. I think at one
It's
point they were
crazy.
like 9 of the first 10 shots. And that's going to get it done, right? And all of their shots were, good shots, right? There weren't like too many shots where you're like, oh, that was a lucky shot, or oh, that was kind of a bailout. It was all pinpoint, picture perfect offense for the most part,
And
right?
up
They
until
knew what
like
they
the
wanted
final
to do.
2 minutes, they were kind of pretty much
Yeah,
shooting like 50% plus from three.
yeah.
It's crazy.
And that happens. And that
Yeah.
happens late in the game when you have like, because they had a double-digit lead in the fourth, I think, at
Hmm.
one point late, right? And that happens where like you're kind of just at a point where you're just trying to run out the clock.
Hmm.
And like that just happens where your offensive execution is not as good because you're running out the clock and
Right.
intentionally stalling for time. Obviously, you want to get a good shot because again, like if it's a really bad shot, Denver's quick enough to get out and run. And again, they kind of did that late, but still, like I said, this is a huge deal because a lot of people, I think ourselves included, kind of thought not that the series was over necessarily, but that like, oh, this may not be much of a series
Sure.
depending on what version of Miami we're getting, but it's a series now. Um, at least right now. Of course, it could always change. We'll have to see what happens. Come game three, which I think is Sunday, right?
Yeah. You said game three?
Or not Sunday,
It's Wednesday.
Wednesday.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
Wednesday.
Wednesday,
Yep.
exactly. So we'll have to see. And again, Hero comes back. That makes a difference.
Hmm.
Um, because like you said, he's a guy that can score off the dribble. He shoots well. He's a guy you have to pay attention to, defensively. Even though
Yep.
again, he's a guy that once you put him in the rotation, he's a guy that's probably going to get targeted on defense,
Hmm.
especially because again, he hasn't played in a while. Um, but again, in Miami with the home crowd behind them, you know, they have a chance. Although, they blew the last two games in Miami, so we'll have to see. And Denver's been a better road team in the playoffs than they were in the regular season. So,
You
we'll just
know,
have to see.
for me, I think, predicting and looking ahead, normally we don't do this like this far ahead, but honestly, I could foresee a split, in the next two games as well. So I think it's probably going to go 2-2. That's just what I think. So I don't
Yeah.
know.
I think
Because I think Denver is probably prone to take one on the road, but also very prone to lose one as well.
this was the game if you're Denver that you shouldn't have lost, where
Exactly.
um, you know, you took control of the game after the first quarter and
Hmm.
had a lead from, most of the rest of the way until, that fourth quarter run when Jokic was on the bench. And then
Right.
after that, Miami just couldn't really just couldn't miss, right? And again, it was good offense because we talked about even in game one, their offensive process was fine. They just couldn't hit shots, but they did in this game. And they've been prone in the playoffs to have these ridiculous 3-point shooting games where they shoot 50, and again 50% from three. And again, they have good shooters, so it's not like that they can't do that more than once. Because again, like Max Strus is a good shooter, Gabe
Right.
Vincent's a good shooter. Even like a Kevin Love is a good shooter. Duncan Robinson obviously is a good shooter. When he comes back, Tyler Hero, right? Kyle Lowry. They have a lot of good shooters. So obviously 48 or 49% from three isn't necessarily what I would say sustainable. Like you can't do that every game, right? Because it didn't happen in game one.
Right.
Um, but again, I think they had three of their four wins against Boston, right? Where they just shot like crazy from the 3-point line. Um, and that's kind of one of the ways where you can win a game, right? A close one, right? Because
Yes.
again, they won the 3-point battle, right? By a decent margin, right? I think they made 17 to Denver's 11, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's 18 points. And then they were basically dead even on free throws. So if you outshoot a team from three and you're about even on the free throw line, you're probably going to win. And again, they did. It was by three, but they were up by more to close out the game. It was more so, like I said, I think Miami took their foot off the gas and were just kind of trying to maintain late in the fourth, whereas Denver, was kind of trying to make one last push. But yeah, great game for Miami in game two. Um, like I said, shocking may not necessarily be the number one word to use, but definitely I think a little bit surprising because I did think Miami would come back and like play better,
Mm-hmm.
and it looked like that in the first quarter, and then they just were awful in that second. But again, they persevered and they made a lot of big shots, tough shots, and Eric Spoelstra again continues to do a really good job. Um, again, he made the adjustments with the starting five. They continued to play zone. That was effective. Um, and it is just kind of wild, right? How these playoffs have gone, right? Because Caleb Martin was, at times their second best player, or some might argue their best player in the conference finals, and then
Mm-hmm.
he pretty much hasn't done anything
So
in
far,
this
yeah.
Denver series, right? Exactly. Yeah, I think he was what 1 for 7 in game one,
And he had
and
three
then in this,
points in this
it was,
game.
yeah, exactly. He was 1 for 3 in this game and came off the bench.
Right.
So I guess Boston fans will probably be kind of fuming about that. Just again, considering how just devastating he was against Boston and how pretty much you know the complete opposite of devastating he's been against Denver. So this series has definitely had so far through the first couple of games some twists and turns because it did feel like initially that Denver was gonna steal that game after that first Miami
Right.
push, but then like I said, Miami kept hanging around and hanging around. And again, I always feel like if you continue to let a team hang around, at some point they're gonna find a way to kind of like push forward, and Miami did. Again, you got a lot of veterans with experience to kind of, I guess make up for also some of those undrafted players who haven't
Sure.
played a ton, right? Jimmy's got experience, Bam's got experience, right? Those guys have been to the
K
finals.
Love.
Love's got finals. Yeah, exactly. Love has finals experience. I think the stat was every playoff that he's been in the finals. So
Yep.
obviously he definitely has finals experience. Um, right? So, and even Duncan Robinson and Lowry, right? So like you have a bunch of guys that are seasoned pros,
They've
and
been here.
yeah, exactly. They're very savvy because again, even with a Duncan Robinson, that's kind of wild how he was a starter for Miami the
I remember
championship
that.
year. And this year he was relegated to the bench for most of the season, and then with the Tyler Hero injury, he's just kind of come back and just kind of resurrected himself, and now he's a big player for them, right? Because again, he started that big fourth quarter comeback in this game, where he hit a couple of big shots, got to the basket. I mean, I think he had 8 at the start of the fourth, so just a big credit to Miami. We'll see if they can pull it off in game three, but again, this is the best you could hope for, if you're the Miami Heat. And I think even as fans, this is probably the best you could hope for, right? Because
Yeah.
we don't necessarily want like a quick series where we're just talking about like 4 games. Like, I think we want to see like a long series or at least a competitive series. You know
Sure.
what I mean?
Yes.
Right? Because like game one to me was not competitive. Like I
It
know
was
Miami
boring.
didn't lose by that much, but it was not a competitive game. This was a legit game, like a big finals game. That could potentially, again, depending on who wins, that this is the type of game that could potentially decide the series, right?
Yeah.
If Denver loses this series, right, you look back at game two, right, and be like, wow, this is kind of one, that we, kind of gave away, right? And if,
Yeah.
Miami loses this series, right, game one is kind of like one where it's like, wow, we were just awful, and we shot so poorly, but we'll see.
Yeah. And for me, I think this is something people aren't talking about enough either, is the stakes are so high for both of these teams, but people are not acknowledging that. This could potentially be Denver's first finals ever, you know? And
Well,
then
it is.
no, I'm saying like this could be their first championship ever.
Yeah,
Um a championship win
yeah,
would be their first one in franchise
exactly.
history. And then with
You're
Miami,
right.
I feel like if they win, this could potentially also be one of the greatest playoff runs in history. So,
Yeah,
I don't know. There's
I
just so
think it
much at
would be.
stake. Yeah, I think it would be the greatest. It has to be because
Yeah,
they're the eighth seed.
yeah, yeah. I think it would be if they. Yeah, because and again, that's a great point in terms of the stakes. Where yeah, there's a lot of guys that could really benefit. From this, right? Because again, both teams' best players, right, core guys, right, are haven't won a title yet, right? Like Jokic, he hasn't won a title.
Right.
That's kind of the one thing he's missing. Um, right. Same with Butler and Bam, right, where they haven't won a title yet. They've been to a finals, right, but they didn't win.
Sure.
Um, but either way, with Butler, right, like this Miami Heat run has pretty much been the main, you know, thing, that's kind of catapulted him into this, superstar status, right? Because again, like he was a really good player before, obviously. But this Miami Heat run has been, incredibly impressive. Because I think at the time when he signed with Miami, a lot of people kind of felt like, what is he doing? Because it was like Philadelphia, you were one Kawhi Leonard shot away, from,
Right.
potentially making it to the finals and maybe, making a championship run, right? And then he leaves, goes to Miami, and I think a lot of people kind of felt like, oh, okay, right, he probably isn't all that interested in winning. He kind of
Right.
wants to go somewhere else and, kind of do his own thing, right? But again, he made the finals in his first year. Um, right? Which is an accomplishment, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, again, it's certainly an accomplishment to win a title, but even just to get to a finals as the best guy, not a lot of guys can do that.
Almost did it
Um,
last year.
yeah, exactly. And then, like you said, almost did it last year and did it again this year as an eighth seed.
Hmm.
So, again, like you said, there's a lot, on the line for both of these teams. I feel like Denver has more to lose. Like if
Yes.
Denver were to lose these finals, I think that would be.
Because
I
they're
don't want to
the
say
they're
like
the one seed in the West too.
yeah, exactly. Like I think that would I don't know. I don't know if embarrassing would be the right word, but I think it would be pretty close to that. Right? Cuz
Yeah.
like you said, they're the 1 seed, Miami's the 8th seed. So I think Denver has a lot to lose like if they were to lose this series, right? Like if
Sure.
Miami loses, it's like, well, they're the 8th seed, they shouldn't even be here anyways, right? But like if you're Denver to get to this point when, there were people that didn't think going into the playoffs that they get to the finals and then to not only lose but lose to an 8th seed, like that would be pretty tough.
Right.
So there definitely are a lot of stakes here. And again, you see that like a lot of these guys, playing hard, right? Like and hustling and battling for extra possessions, right?
Hmm.
But to kind of see some of these other guys who didn't do that, right? Like Michael Porter Jr. and
Yes.
and a couple of guys for Denver, right? That's just kind of disappointing because again, in these type of games, like if you're not going to play hard in a finals game, I mean, when would you? You
Right.
know, again, he did it in game one. I thought
Yeah.
he had a decent, even though he didn't shoot well from three. I thought he had a pretty solid game one in terms of battling on the boards. He even got a couple of blocks. Um, but again, this is kind of his thing where, because of the role he's in, like he's probably just going to be really up and down, which again doesn't feel good because he's making a lot of money.
Exactly.
But, given that, again, he's not a guy that you run a ton of things for. If he has like, these type of games, right? Like it's rough because again,
Yeah.
he's not going to give you a whole lot consistently on defense and probably isn't going to give you much on defense if his shot's not falling. I feel like he's kind of one of those guys where like the rest of his game gets kind of unlocked if he starts hitting shots.
Sure. Because
Like
then
and
he
there are
starts
guys
getting hot and get to his
yeah, exactly.
spots.
Like even like yeah, exactly. Even a guy like a J.R. Smith, right, where when his shot was falling, right, you would see him start trying to score off the dribble.
Right.
Maybe throw those lob passes.
Right.
Right. But when his shot wasn't falling, you almost didn't even notice he was out there.
Yeah.
And there
It's
are
kind
other
of a
guys like that.
microwave.
Exactly. So, just in general, right? Like I think that's if you're Denver, that's what you would like to see. Is I just think better defensive effort and execution because it just
Yeah.
felt like there was a lot of like just like disconnected tissue going
Sure.
on in that game. A lot of guys just making mistakes that they didn't make in the first game. Um, but again, you still have to give credit to the team that won in Miami because they made the right adjustments and they executed again to a T, right? And you have to against a team like Denver because they're really good. and they will pick you apart if you make mistakes, right? So these are the type of games, if you're Miami, you have to win, especially if you want to have a chance at winning the series, which now they do.
Yeah. And, for me, I think the best way to sum up this game is kind of like, Denver showed little to no effort, I think, in multiple facets of their game, but Miami looked so locked in. Like, I don't know. There's something about the way that Miami looked tonight that honestly, I kind of want to give them the edge, but I can't just due to the fact that Denver is the 1 seed and Miami's the 8th seed. I
Yeah.
don't know. It's tough. It's a tough decision, but both of these teams have played hard, I think, through this series so far because, in game one, it was kind of the opposite. Denver looked super locked in, but Miami kind of, they looked a little slow. But now it's been completely reversed and the script has been flipped. But nonetheless, this is heating up, and I enjoy it. No pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I thought Denver's bench guys gave a ton of effort. Obviously they couldn't do a whole lot in the fourth, but I thought that they, were kind of the driving factor behind Denver's. If they had won the game, obviously outside of Jokic, I think you would have given a lot of credit to
Yeah,
Denver's
we would have been
reserve.
talking about their
They
bench.
did a really good job. Just finding, ways to compete and again, play hard on both ends of the floor, right? Because again, like if Jokic is off the floor, you're probably not gonna score a ton anyways, but if you can figure out ways to get stops, right, that's how you're going to score
Exactly.
when he's not out there. And they did that in the first half. They just couldn't get it done in the fourth.
Right.
Um, but yeah, like you said, either way, it was a great game. And hopefully, the series picks up, right? Because game one was kind of rough. We talked about it. It was kind of it was a very one sided game, not in a
Mm-hmm.
bad way, right? But just more so like, it just felt like Denver was a lot better than Miami in game one. But you saw a fight from Miami. And again, that's kind of what they have to do to win this series. And like I said,
Yes.
now they have a chance. I still feel like you said, I still think you have to lean towards Denver
Mm-hmm.
just because, again, you had, a number of guys, key guys play poorly for Denver and it was a close game.
Yeah.
But again, it's still a big deal that Miami was able to pull one, away in Denver when no one
Exactly.
else at this point up to these playoffs, had been able to do that.
Exactly.
So I guess you know, after our recap of the game, I guess now we might as well get into some news around the league because we had some big things happen. Obviously the first one is Frank Vogel, former Lakers coach, also, used to coach Indiana. Looks like he's going to be the coach for the Phoenix Suns with a
Uh-huh.
5-year, $13 million deal, right? So not in the Monty Williams range, right? But still, he's a head coach.
Yeah.
Um, Kind of funny, right? Because in our previous podcast, it was rumored, that Kevin Young, who was an assistant, kind of had like the lead in terms of like the guy that was going to be the head coach.
Yeah.
Supposedly he has a great relationship with Devin Booker. Um, but in the end, Frank Vogel got the job. Kind of an interesting hire, right? Obviously, he was the head coach for that championship Lakers team. Right, he was a big part, of the defensive schemes, which I thought were really good for LA.
Yes, sir.
Um, right, obviously he's got some weaknesses as an offensive coach, right? But reportedly the Kevin Young assistant coach, right? He's going to be now one of the highest paid assistant coaches. And part of that is he's supposed to be a really good offensive mind. So I think that's a really good combination when you have an elite defensive coach and a really good offensive coach. Um, the key for Phoenix, I think, now is kind of the personnel, right? Because you also need good defensive personnel, I think, to play good defense, right? Because his last year in LA, the Lakers, outside of like that early stretch of the season, they were pretty bad defensively for the
Sure.
most part. AD missed a lot of time, right? But still, like, you know, they signed a lot of guys that were more offensive oriented players, right? Guys like I guess like a Malik Monk, Carmelo, Wayne Ellington, right? Traded for Russell Westbrook.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot more like offensive leaning guys, right? And I think the thought process was, okay, well, he's a defensive coach, so he can get these guys to play defense. But yeah, like it's kind of proven at this point where like some guys just are not good defenders.
Sure.
Um, Even if you put them like, with a team or with, a guy that, knows how to defend.
Right.
So it's going to be interesting, but I still think that they need to search for defensive personnel because again, like Durant and Booker are not bad defenders at all, right? They're fine.
Yeah.
But the rest of that roster, I mean, Chris Paul at this point is no longer the same defensively. Aiton's not really much of a defender.
Mm-hmm.
Um, right. So like after that, like I mean, Cameron Payne, again, not much of a defender, and most of the guys that they signed, and acquired late, right? Like T.J. Warren, um, guys like that, just not a lot of options there.
Yeah, I feel like
So
they only have
to
like a
me,
select few, like, a Kogi and maybe like Torrey Craig,
yeah,
I guess occasionally.
and I think those guys are free agents if I'm not
Right.
mistaken. Um, so I think they're gonna have to find defensive personnel. But I do like the hires just
Yeah.
because again, I like again having a guy that preaches defense, and combining that with a really good offensive mind. It's just again, you need the personnel, and that's gonna be hard again because kind of like the Warriors, they're in a spot where they're way into that super tax line, and it's going to be really difficult for them to find guys. But in terms of the coaching, I think this is fine because I think Vogel is a good coach.
Me too.
Obviously, right, it didn't work out, towards the end of LA, but and again, he didn't do a great job, but he wasn't the biggest issue
Right.
there. So I think this is a fine hire.
Yeah, me
And
too.
also like yeah, we were kind of talking about it like we thought it was going to be the other guy just because of what was rumored, but
Yeah.
obviously that wasn't the case. But go on.
Yeah, I don't mind this hire at all, actually. And I feel like Vogel's a really good coach, but people don't talk about it a lot, just due to the fact that he has made some pretty big mistakes. But like you said, in LA, I didn't have a problem with him, and I definitely didn't have a problem with him in Indiana. He almost took, or well, that Indiana team almost took out LeBron. So there's potential here for this team to be good. I think like you said, with the right personnel, I think they could probably have a really good stretch and time there, but it all depends on, like you said, if they get some defensive role players, honestly, some guys to beef up that defensive end of their roster.
Yeah, cause again, like with that championship LA team, I mean, they had like a ton of size,
Yeah.
and athleticism, and that's kind of how he likes to play, right? Because I mean,
Right.
they started AD as a power forward, in the title year. Obviously, as the playoffs went by, he played more at the five, right? But for
Sure.
the regular season, he played, mostly at the four, next to JaVale, next to Dwight Howard,
Right.
right? LeBron was at the three, right? So that's a big team, right? That's a big team with a lot of athleticism.
Right.
Um, right, and you have some, obviously Aiton's a big guy.
Mm-hmm.
Durant's tall. I wouldn't necessarily say big, right, but he's tall.
Yeah.
Um, but still, you need other guys. I wonder now, like, kind of in a funny way, right? Like, does Avery Bradley find his way on Phoenix?
Ooh.
Because it seemed like Vogel, that was a guy that he really liked. Probably not, because again, like, he was a guy, right, where he, was pretty good for a while, right? But it was pretty clear his last year in LA, like, he was probably close to being done.
Sure.
Um,
I'd forgotten
and
about
again,
him.
yeah, it's kind of funny just looking back on that team, how many guys aren't even in the league,
Right.
that were on that team. But he was a guy that was clearly a big, favorite of Vogel's. I'm not saying that they're gonna sign Avery Bradley. It was kind of more so just a joke, but
No, no,
I
no.
do think,
I get
yeah, again, with this, new ownership, right? You kind of have to make these type of moves, where again, you got to get creative, and because again, like they're in a spot where they're going to be penalized for spending a lot of money, so you have to probably get really creative, and it's going to be tough because again, these new rules are really punitive on those type of teams.
yes.
But again, if you fire Monty Williams, who again I don't even think he was bad,
Nope.
um, but if you're gonna fire Monty Williams, right, whoever you hire, it needs to make sense, right? It shouldn't be a downgrade, in my opinion. I guess, and again, like they're probably on similar levels. Again, I think Monty's the better offensive coach, but
Yeah.
Vogel is definitely the superior defensive coach. Um, but again, like at the NBA level, coaching is important as we've always said, but you also need to have the personnel. So, we'll see how this goes. But
I
again,
like it.
so far I think that's a good start to the offseason if you're Phoenix. And obviously, you would think there's probably more to come once we actually get into the offseason, right? Because there's only so much you can do right now.
Right.
But so far, this is a good start, I think.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah. More coaching hires. But these are assistant coaches. Sam Cassell, Terry Stotts, according to Woj, Sam Cassell is going to join Boston's coaching staff, right, to help out Joe Mazzulla.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, this is important, right, because they lost a number of assistants going into this year, and Mazzulla was an assistant himself, right. So getting another guy that has experience, who seems to be a highly regarded assistant, right, that should help. Just to give again, just to have guys with experience in there to help him out, because again, like the Udoka thing, it hurts if you're Boston, right, because he
Mm-hmm.
was the superior coach, but he's gone now, and he's not obviously not coming back. So you kind of have to figure out what you're going to do, and I think this is a good step, right, in terms of getting him some help, right, just so that way he's not kind of like on an island for the most part.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is a step in the right direction, like you said. And Cassell, like you said, he's pretty much revered among coaching, I think. And I honestly always wondered why he never, you know, had a head coaching job. I'm not sure if he has, but that could just be the casual in me. So I don't know if he's had a head coaching job, but I always thought he deserved a shot at it at least. So I don't know, but I do like the hire because I feel like he does have a great basketball mind. He's a great player, in my opinion. Um, not like one of the greatest of all time, but a solid guy. Um, and I feel like people respect him, so I don't mind that hire at all. And like you said, that definitely will help Missoula as well because Cassell is pretty older or pretty much older than him too. So he does have some
Yeah,
wise factor to it as well. So
he's
it should help.
yeah, he's 53, and I
Yeah,
believe he was on the Celtics 2008 team that won the
yes,
title. So obviously got some ties there as well. He's
exactly.
never had a head coaching job. I just checked.
Right. Okay,
He's always been an assistant.
that's what I thought.
Um, yeah,
I
and
like
then
that though.
going back to Terry, yeah, and then going back to Terry Stotts, right? So he's going to be an assistant in Milwaukee, right, to help
Hmm.
out Adrian Griffin. Obviously we know he was a former head coach, coached in Portland. Did I think a decent job there, right? Obviously, again, had some years where they just, didn't have like great rosters. But I think he did a decent job in terms of what he had. He seems like he's more of an offensive minded coach, right? Because
Okay.
again, those Portland teams were never good
Right.
defensively.
Yeah.
And Milwaukee's offense was not that great this year. Obviously, they had the stretches, without key guys, but I think the main thing that definitely hurt them in the series against Miami, obviously, other than the Giannis injury, was just their inability to score
Sure.
down the stretch, right? Against because again, they had double-digit fourth quarter leads in games 4 and 5, right? And they just
They would self
fell
implode.
apart on offense. Yeah, exactly, right? Like Giannis, he was going to the basket, right, but either didn't convert or just, missed a ton of free throws, right?
Hmm.
Drew Holiday, Chris Middleton, a lot of ill-advised shots, right? They went away, kind of from that two-man Lopez and Giannis game. Um, so obviously this should kind of help modernize. Not that Milwaukee's offense isn't modernized, right? But just, being able so that way you don't have those type of issues down the stretch.
Right.
This should help, right? And again, it's not like they have, because again, Giannis is a different guy, as a superstar, in terms of most of his damage is around the basket, right? Even though he
Sure.
can handle the ball, he's not usually going to win you a ton of games, right? By, hitting big time jumpers, right? Um, obviously we've seen him hit big jump shots, and even to win the title, he hit a ton of free throws, right? But that's not normally his game.
Right.
So obviously they're kind of a different team where their superstar isn't like a perimeter oriented guy, right? Because even like a Jokic, right, who's a big man, he can hit shots from the outside, right? Same with Embiid. Um, but either way, just in general, right? That should help them, I think, on the offensive end. Again, I don't know what Adrian Griffin will do as a head coach, right? Because unlike Frank Vogel, right, we don't know the track record.
Sure.
But I think this is still a decent hire because
Yeah.
again, like Milwaukee's defense, in the regular season was really good. And even in the playoffs, I thought it was fine. It was just that offense, just for whatever reason, just fell apart a lot down the stretch. And
Yeah.
hopefully this will help them out.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is definitely a help. And like you said, we don't we have no real sample of their head coach, but I feel like one when you're adding more people to the team and in specifically the coaching aspect, that's always a help because the more minds, the better. I think and especially if they're competent basketball minds, the more of those that you have together, I think that's also a recipe for success, and keeping your superstar happy. So I'm sure Giannis also played a factor into this hire as well, probably behind the scenes, but I can't argue with it. I like it.
Oh yeah, and also just to issue a correction, it was 5 years, 31 million, not
Okay,
5 years, 30.
okay, got you.
So that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Um, Moving on into the next rumor. So according to Woj, kind of continuing on this coaching discussion,
Hmm.
it sounds like because of the Monty Williams contract, it sounds like that there's going to sort of be a movement now for some of these other top tier coaches, right? So Woj reported guys like Steve Kerr, Eric Spoelstra, those guys on their next contracts could make 20 million a year.
Oh wow.
Um, which is kind of wild, right? That we've gotten to this point. But again, in a way, it makes sense, right? Because again, Monty Williams is going to be the highest paid coach, I think, in the NBA next season, right? And he's certainly not, the best coach in the NBA, right? He's not a bad coach at all, right? But he shouldn't necessarily be the highest paid head coach.
Sure.
Um, so it makes a lot of sense, right? Because again, those guys obviously are going to be like, well, this guy's getting, you know, 20 million a year or whatever, right?
Right.
So that means you got to pay us
Yeah.
20 million a year. He also kind of interestingly he mentioned for that it was more so of a guarantee with Spoelstra than Kerr, um, which was kind of interesting just
Hmm.
because again, like obviously Spoelstra's not going anywhere, right? Because he's been in Miami forever, right? I think he was the video intern like almost 30 years ago,
Yeah.
so he's obviously not going anywhere. But he did mention with Bob Myers gone, like you could have it's not like he necessarily said that Kerr was not going to come back when his contract is up, but he did mention, quote unquote, this is an aging roster, and the worldview for Steve Kerr might be a little different. So
Sure.
watch his negotiations this summer on an extension. And obviously maybe he just signs an extension outright, right? But that is something to kind of think about, right? Because again, with his situation, right? He is coaching an older roster, right? Where obviously they have young guys, right? But their core is older, and they probably don't have too many more deep playoff runs left in them, right? And I would imagine he probably wouldn't want to stick around, right? If the team like 3 seasons from now just is not a good roster.
Sure.
Um, but either way, obviously, it's more so, the big conversation is primarily on the coaches getting raises, which again, I don't really have a problem with because again, there's no salary cap when it comes to coaches. You can pretty much pay them as much as you want to pay them, obviously, within whatever financial constraints that, your team has, but
Hmm.
there's no penalty, right, for paying coaches, right? So obviously we know like you could technically, yes, overpay for a coach, but it doesn't hurt you in any real way, right? Like it doesn't, cap your
Right. Right.
ability
Right.
to put together a roster like it does with the players, right? Because we know if you overpay a player and give them a bad contract, that can really set your team back. That doesn't happen with coaches because there's no, salary cap for coaches the way there is for players.
Yeah. Um, and I have a couple things to say on that because I feel like people have always kind of put a question mark on Steve Kerr's coaching ability. Like from the moment he got there, people always said he got carried by his players, whatever. So I'm curious to see if people are gonna continue with that narrative. You know, as time goes on, like you said, older roster. So I'm curious about that. And second, you know, with these guys making 20 million a year, do you think the players are gonna feel some type of way about that? Because there's definitely gonna be players that aren't making, 20 mil a year. That do you think they would
Yeah.
feel any type of way about that? Because I personally don't, but I feel like that's just something interesting where, you know, some coaches might be making more than some guys on their roster, you know?
Well, in fairness, I think the minimum contract in the NBA is like around 2-3 million. So
Right.
there are definitely coaches that are making more than that even right now.
Right.
Um, so I mean, it makes sense. Like you said, I don't necessarily know if there's going to be a level of contempt necessarily,
Hmm.
because again, I'm assuming that they know, the salary cap situation where like you can only pay,
Right, right,
you
right.
know, guys, players so much, whereas that's not the case with the coaches. But you do kind of wonder, right? But either way, the cap is going to go up. So
Yeah.
like guys, are going to benefit, once that TV deal kicks in,
Yep.
right? And there's going to be guys, again, we know down the stretch, right? There's going to be guys that are going to be making like 40, 50, 60 million a
Hmm.
year down the stretch. Obviously not every player is making that, but there was a time, right, when a role player might just get like 5 million a year,
Right.
right? But now you got role players that might be making like 15,
Yep.
20, right? Exactly. So it's only going to continue to go up. So, I don't necessarily feel I'm kind of with you where I don't feel like that's going to be the case. But obviously some players probably will feel a certain way, right? Cuz again, right? Like these guys all want to get paid,
Hmm.
right? And and sometimes you're going to feel like, hey, I'm very important to my team, so I should be getting paid more than, XYZ or whatever, right?
Exactly.
Cuz we've seen that in the past, right? Where guys didn't get paid as much as they thought they should have. So, I think there could be a case for that, but I still feel like I would lean more towards you where I don't think that's going to be the case. Cuz
Right.
again, like over the next few years and pretty much every year the contracts usually go up at least somewhat, right? Like they
Yeah.
don't take that huge increase like we've seen in the past, right? But they go up every year. So we're gonna see guys continue to make more money.
More. Yeah.
Yeah, both and I guess it's just now that the coaches are gonna be making
Right.
more than they were before. Because
Hmm.
having multiple coaches making 20 million a year, that's never happened before.
Yeah.
Right. We crossed the threshold of guys making 30 of multiple players making 30 million a year a while back. Right now we got guys making, around 50. And it's gonna be more. So
Yeah.
yeah. Moving on into the next rumor, Steve Bulpett of Heavy. Reportedly, teams will be interested in Grant Williams. I think that makes sense, right? Like, I mean, of course, we don't know how much. Um,
Right.
right? But it does say Celtics forward likely to be pursued by multiple teams with offer sheets that would be difficult to match. Um, and again, that kind of happens once you start having a number of guys, right, that you draft, is that it does become harder to keep everybody. And that's sometimes why the draft route can be hard because first
Yeah.
you have to find the guys, and then eventually down the road you have to pay them, right? Which is why, like ideally it's always great to like be in a position where you find a bunch of these guys before you have to pay them, right? But obviously, with what happened with Boston this year and his minutes, it seemed like kind of dropped off for most of the season until like the last round or so.
Yeah.
Uh, right? Because he played a decent amount early, for chunks of the regular season. But once the playoffs began, like he wasn't really playing at all until like down the stretch of this series.
Hmm.
And he would play like sparingly. So it kind of felt like okay, maybe he might be on his way out. Again, it kind of just comes down to, like some of these other young guys. How much money are they going to get from other teams, and how much
Right.
are they going to be willing to pay to keep him? Right.
Yeah.
I don't feel like if he gets like 15 million a year, I don't think Boston's matching that.
No.
But if it's like somewhere around like, 10, right? I think that's probably somewhat doable for them. Again, it's just the key, like a lot of these other teams, is once you pay Jalen Brown, and Jason Tatum's on that big contract, you don't really have the flexibility to spend. So, you might have to say goodbye to some of these guys, right? And it's not like Grant Williams is like really a core part of the team, right? Like he's a decent player, but he's not a guy where it's like, you know, if you lose him, you know, it like, you're done, right?
Yeah.
Because again, he's a solid player,
Yeah.
but he's not a guy that you absolutely have to have. I mean, obviously you want to retain guys because again, he's still probably better than what you can get in free agency because they're not going to have cap space if he walks.
Yeah.
But it's not the same as like if Jalen Brown walked, right? Like if Jalen Brown walked, you'd be in serious trouble. But I don't think you're in serious trouble if Grant Williams walks. Because again, there's gonna be like a hard line, that most of these type of teams are gonna have to set. Because we've talked about that with other teams, like
Hmm.
with the Lakers, and say like Austin Reeves or a Rui Hachimura, right? Like
Yeah.
there's gonna be a limit. Probably not for Reeves necessarily, but I definitely think, say for like a guy like a Rui, right? If a team gives him like more than like 20 million a year or more, he's probably gone,
Yeah.
right? So it's just going to be kind of interesting to see how Boston, threads that needle. Because again, like, with the way that this season ended, it's possible there could be some big changes this offseason. Obviously, not with, I think, their top guys, but I think with the guys around
Hmm.
Tatum and Brown, there could be a decent amount of change.
Sure. And, for me, I feel like, Boston's not gonna, you know, do everything in their power to keep him. I think that's probably not going to happen. I could probably see him getting like picked up by like, I don't know, Detroit or, you know, the Spurs or some team like that. Like I feel like he's kind of not in the same boat as Dylan Brooks, but he's in that tier where it's like he could be a good rotational player on a bad team, if that makes sense. Just a team
Yeah,
that's in a rebuild or, is on the cusp of, you know,
yeah.
potentially getting there, but I can't be mad at teams for wanting him because he does bring somewhat of a defensive prowess and sometimes can hit corner threes. So I don't think he's a bad player at all. So I like it.
And again, that's going to be something to factor in because we know that some of these teams, you know, with cap space, there's multiple teams that I think are below what's known as like the salary floor,
Mm-hmm.
where like they basically have to spend money. I think because I think there's a floor, and if you're not at that floor, then usually what happens is you just spread out the remainder of the money until you get there to the rest of the players.
Right.
Um, but basically, we know that there's multiple teams that are going to have a decent amount of cap space, and they're going to, probably throw a lot of money out at certain guys, right?
Yeah, for
But
sure.
like, again, like, is it going to be a crazy amount, right? Like, I mean, I couldn't see. I'd be pretty surprised if like the Spurs threw like 20 million a year
No,
at Grant Williams.
it's
Like
probably
that
going to
just,
be around 15, 16.
yeah, like I think they're going to definitely like throw out a ton of contract offers to a lot of guys
Mm-hmm.
because again, they kind of have to, right? Because again, if they don't get those guys, right, then they're going to have to probably give big money to like the even lower tier guys,
Exactly.
right? So that's kind of the issue there. So that again, there are some years where that happens, and this is a weak free agency class, right? So
Yeah,
this is a
very.
year where guys like a Dylan Brooks or a Grant Williams are probably closer to the top of that free agency tier, whereas like in years past they'd be probably in that middle tier or
Right.
maybe even closer towards the bottom tier, right? But in in a free agency like this class with a lot of guys that could have gone into free agency that signed extensions, right? Like say like an Andrew Wiggins, right? He signed an extension, so he's not going anywhere. Um, right? Then that kind of puts these other guys in these weird, interesting spots where they could potentially be, paid. But again, like either way, you do have to kind of pay guys if you want to keep them
Sure.
now. Um, and the other factor I think that's would also kind of be interesting is that once a guy like Grant Williams makes a decent amount of money, you almost don't really have much of a choice but, having to play him a lot, right? Because
Right.
like let's say, he's making like 15 million a year, right? Like, that'd be kind of a weird position, to kind of, all of a sudden have long stretches where he's out of the rotation, right? Even with like a D'Angelo Russell, right? Like let's say if he was getting paid like, 25 million a year, right? Like, the thing of benching him late in games, probably that's a lot tougher of a sell.
Hmm.
Or a guy like a Rui, right, where maybe he starts, so because again, contracts kind of play a big deal. I think I heard Gilbert Arenas, kind of mention that on one of his podcasts, right, where like once guys get paid, it's very difficult, to kind of mess with their minutes a whole lot,
Sure. That is true. That's a great point.
Yeah. Moving on to another rumor from the Wall Street Journal. Um, Rachel Bachman, I guess that's her name, mentioned Phil Knight, right? So Nike, I guess, co-founder,
Hmm.
right? So he still, is kind of interested in trying to buy the Blazers. Obviously, he's, got a decent amount of ties, I think, to Portland, Oregon.
Yeah.
Um, we know that reportedly he wanted to buy Portland, I think, or buy the team earlier in the season or
Hmm.
last season, but he was, I guess, told off, I guess, by the current team governor.
Hmm.
So I mean, it's kind of an interesting scenario, I guess, right? Again, it seems like every time, something like this has happened, seems like the team governor, Jody Allen, kind of just seems like she's saying that it's not up for sale.
Right.
Again, we'll have to see, right? Because we saw Phoenix, right, get sold. I mean, that was a different situation, right? But like, they got sold for what, 3, 4 billion.
Yeah.
So I suppose if what,
So that right, it's just the context of that situation. It's not a laughing matter, but the difference in the reasons is pretty
yeah, but
pretty
like,
large.
yeah, exactly. But like, I'm assuming, she might be like, well, if you're gonna buy this team, like, you're gonna have to give us a lot. Because again, like we have seen these teams go for a decent amount of money in these last few years, um, more than they had in the past, right? We know like obviously like 5, 10 years ago, right, you didn't have to spend 3 billion to buy a team, right? But
Right.
now you kind of do, maybe more.
Yeah.
As the league continues to be more and more profitable. So I don't know. I mean, he tried it before and it didn't work, so I'm gonna assume the same thing is gonna happen,
Yeah.
where she's probably just not gonna sell it. But it would be kind of interesting because again, Portland's been in this strange spot where you do almost kind of wonder, like, if a different ownership, maybe might be kind of what takes the team to the next level. Because
Right.
again, like Portland is still in that weird area where they're not good enough to contend, even though they have a guy where you probably want to contend with him rather than just lose with him.
Hmm.
Um, and then, like, at the same time, right, they're in an area where in Portland where you're just not going to get a lot of stars to come there. So you have to build through the draft, right? So you almost kind of have to be bad, or you just have to get really lucky in terms of who you draft. But it's been kind of tough for them. So I don't know. I don't even know if he would like make that much of a difference. Maybe he does, right? But it is kind of something interesting to talk about because it seems like he really wants that team.
Yeah. I don't think ownership is the problem in Portland. I think it's definitely management, and that's a huge difference. I think, ownership and management can be extremely different, but in some cases the lines can get blurred. If you look at the NFL, you look at Dan Snyder, he was all up in the mix. But, in the NBA, it can happen, but for me, I don't think it would make that big of a difference unless, say Phil Knight buys it and then, he cleans house. I think that's a different story. But Portland definitely has some work to do on the management end of things, I think personally, because, it's been a long time since they've contended. And when they did contend, I always felt like, it was exciting to watch Dame, in the playoffs because I feel like he's one of the clutcher players in the league. Definitely one of the better shooters. The percentage is kind of, Ari, but it is what it is. I feel like he is one of the better shooters. So to not have him in the playoffs consistently is definitely a crime. We've said that multiple times, but I don't think it has anything to do with ownership because I feel like that owner or governor, excuse me, is probably one of the more quiet ones. I don't really hear much about her, so
Yeah.
I don't know. It is what it
Initially,
is.
it was Paul Allen, and he
Right.
passed away. So
Yes.
now he has it, kind of like New Orleans.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, it probably would do Portland some good to get a change of uh, leadership, I guess. But and it does make sense, like you said. Phil Knight does have ties. I believe he's from there, or he went to school in Oregon, something like that. Um, but I don't know. It's to me, it doesn't really matter, honestly, because like I said, I think it goes to management and the roster more so than the ownership.
Moving on, Tim McMahon of ESPN, on his podcast mentioned some NBA insiders believe that Phoenix is more likely to trade DeAndre Ayton and that Chris Paul stays.
Okay.
Um, so I mean, obviously it's an executive's opinion, right? So obviously there's going to be, obviously there's some bias and some context that you have to take in there. I don't know about that one. That one seems kind of bizarre because
Hmm.
again, like I don't know. Maybe that might translate to it's easier to trade Aiton than Chris Paul. I feel like
Sure.
that might be more so
I
what it
think that's what it's
translates
going
to.
on. Yeah.
Yeah, only because like I could see a team like even with how DeAndre Ayton played, I could see a team like realistically like talking themselves into DeAndre Ayton,
Hmm.
maybe even with him making a ton of money.
Hmm.
But I would have a really hard time buying into like a team, you know, taking on Chris Paul unless like they're just taking on his contract to just buy him out.
Right.
Because again, like at this point on a max contract, he's kind of a negative, right? Because he's not a guarantee to play a lot. And even in the playoffs, right? Like he's just been up and down because again, usually either he gets hurt or he just kind of just runs out of gas or runs out of steam. So obviously he's a guy that you kind of have to load manage during the
Hmm.
regular season. So I feel like that's more so what it is. I mean, of course, I don't know because I don't know who the person, who the executive is. And I'm not calling the rumor into question. I'm just saying, like, I feel like it more so translates to DeAndre Ayton is probably easier to trade than Chris Paul, just
Yeah.
in terms of like the value.
Yeah. And for me, I think both of those players have a low value, specifically after this season, and really after the postseason, because we saw Chris Paul get hurt, and then DeAndre Ayton just flamed out, gave up pretty much. So I don't know how much value they have, and I don't know what teams are looking to acquire those guys. But that's a decision that they have to think long and hard about. But I do understand if Phoenix does want to get rid of both or one of them, so I get it.
Yeah, I think Chris Paul's value is more like negative, where like
Sure.
you may, if you're Phoenix, you may have to give up like a pick or something to get off of his contract.
Right.
Whereas like I don't think Aiton's is super positive. But I feel like another team could be like, yeah, we'll give you, X, Y, and Z role players or something
Sure.
for Aiton, right? Like he's not like he's not a guy anymore where like you should be forced into giving up a bunch of picks to get him.
Exactly.
Um, but I think Chris Paul is definitely the one that has more negative value, just
Sure.
because again, like Aiton's still a young guy. Um, you know, and the young guys still do have value. Like it's different now because he's on a max contract.
Hmm.
Obviously, so it's not quite as high. Like he's like you said, his value's definitely probably at an all-time low at this point. But even at an all-time low, I feel like the value is still probably higher just
Yeah,
because he's still a young guy and he is a big man, that does have good touch and that does have value,
I agree.
to a team, particularly like a young team, right? Like I don't think a contender would probably trade for DeAndre Ayton because
No.
again, with his big contract, that you're kind of locked into him being like probably one of your, three best players, which, again, unless you have two superstars, right, you're probably just not going to be good enough.
Exactly.
So, again, we'll see. Because again, it's again like some of these other teams, it should be a busy offseason for them. They don't have as much flexibility, right? But I wouldn't be surprised to hear those guys continue to be in rumors,
Yeah,
throughout the offseason. Because again, like that's pretty much like the main way that Phoenix can get better, right? Is you'd have to move at least one of those guys
yeah,
because if you just run it back, you're probably still not good enough because you still have the issue of depth. Um, and that's kind of in order to get that depth, you're gonna have to give up at least one of those guys. And I
right.
feel like you would probably prefer to give up Paul, just because of the age factor,
Yes,
right? Because again, like Chris Paul could maybe like I mean, obviously he's still a solid player, right? But again, like there's a scenario where like he could just like retire at the end of his contract, right? Like
literally,
what, like a year or two. Whereas
quite
like
literally.
DeAndre, even 10 years from now, will still probably be playing.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's kind of how you have to look at it.
Mhm.
And then our last rumor, or I guess last piece of news, Anthony Edwards, according to Chris Haynes, has left Clutch Sports to sign with Bill Duffy. So this is kind of interesting. Again, I don't know, a ton, right, about the agency, right? I mean, reportedly, his reasoning was more so, according to a text that one of these guys got, it was more so just, again, the Bill Duffy guy, right? He signed with WME.
Mhm.
And obviously, like for him, because he, was an all-star, obviously he's probably looking to put himself in a situation where I think, this offseason, right, he's going to be eligible for an extension, right? Because
Yeah.
this was his third year, right?
Yeah. I think he's probably looking for max money. I think that's probably what's
Exactly.
going on.
Yeah, exactly. And I think because of what happened this season with him being an all-star, I think he's pretty much eligible, for that. I think it's
Right.
5 years, 195,
Right.
right? So, and obviously, like he's gonna get that, right? Because like,
Easily.
yeah, exactly. Because he's pretty much the future of the team.
He's their franchise.
Right? He's young. He's very good. Um, so like, just in general, right? Like, you can't let him go, and they're not gonna let him go, right? But obviously, like, you want to put yourself in a good position when you're going into contract negotiations,
Yeah.
right? So it helps to have somebody who's one of the best in the business, right?
Yeah.
According to the reports.
And like, you can get it done quickly and swiftly with a guy, who has a name and, a reputation. So I think that's what's going on. It's probably going to be easier for him to get that contract with the backing and support of his newfound agent. If we look at football, it took Lamar Jackson all these months to get that money, but we have to talk about it because his mother was handling his negotiation. It's there's just a certain level of respect that you have when you have a guy who's seasoned and knows how to get deals done versus somebody who may have little to no experience or just less experience in general. So I feel like this is a good thing for him. And he's for sure going to get that money because he's the future. And we talked about that multiple times. If you had to choose between Cat and Ant, I think you're choosing Ant every time. Now that we know what Ant is and we know what Cat is.
Yeah. And also, Jaden McDaniels, I believe, in that same article, right? He has the same agent and
Okay.
agency. Right? Obviously, I think he's in the same position too, where he's looking to get paid. Obviously, he's not going to get paid as much as Edwards, but
Right.
I think because he's a big athletic wing, right? Who's pretty good on both ends of the floor. I could see him getting like close to 20 million a year,
Yeah.
which sounds like a lot, right? But again, like you know when it comes to those type of players, right, the big athletic wings, right, that can, give you things on both ends of the floor, right, and especially on the defensive end,
Hmm.
like you got to pay those guys, and that's just kind of the price
Yeah.
of these type of players, right? Like Andrew Wiggins, right, he got his extension, right, and some people felt like that was kind of a steal, right? When you consider how he played in last year's playoffs,
Yes.
what he ended up getting, right? I think he's making less than Jordan Poole,
Which is
so
crazy.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, just in general, right? Like I mean, for those two guys, right? Obviously, if you're Minnesota, you got to keep those two guys because they're a big part, I think, of the team's
Yeah.
future. And again, like again, as we continue to say, if they walk, you have no means of replacing them.
Exactly.
Obviously, so it's like you know, you have to do what you have to do, right? You're only hurting yourself if you try to lowball them, or don't keep them or whatever, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't benefit Minnesota in any way to let either of those guys walk.
Yeah.
Right? Like obviously you probably don't want to pay McDaniels like 30 million a year. I don't even think he can make that much, I think because he was like a late first
Yeah.
round pick or something like that. But
Hmm.
either way, like there's a limit for sure, right? But if as long as it's like, in a relatively realistic realm, right? Like both of those guys will be well, we know Edwards will be back, and I think McDaniels will be back as well. Because you also have to factor in like those guys also know realistically what they're worth as well, right? Like
Yeah.
McDaniels is not going to walk in there and be like, "All right, give me 40 million a year,
And with an
or else I
agent
won't."
like that, no.
Exactly, right? And like we've seen players in the past make mistakes, right? Like Dennis Schroeder,
Yeah.
right? I think he turned down what was it like 4 years, 80 from the Lakers because he thought he could get like 100 million plus
Yep.
from another team, right? And then he was forced into taking 5 million from
Yeah.
Boston
It was
minimum,
unfortunate, man.
yeah, this year, right? So, and again, he wouldn't be the only guy, but just in general, right? Like, that's where again, like you said, you got to have a really good representation in terms of an agent, right? Because you want to make sure you get, every penny that you can get, right?
Yeah,
And
you
that's
never
not a
want to
real,
get
that's not a
lowballed.
bad, yeah, yeah, exactly. Make sure you don't get lowballed because again, like, that's money that you and your family, can have and do whatever you need to do with,
Generational
for a very
wealth.
long time. Exactly. So, you got to take that seriously. So obviously you can't make those type of mistakes. So you got to hire the best, in order to get the best, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, obviously, these continue to be lengthy, I suppose, but again, there's still a lot to talk about, even
Hmm.
outside of the NBA Finals, right? We had a number of rumors and news to talk about, in addition to the game and the series, which seems like it should be a pretty good series. We'll see going forward. Obviously, don't forget, after Game 3, on Wednesday, we're gonna have a live stream.
Yes, sir.
And I believe we're also going to have a live stream following Game 4.
Yep.
And then also, again, as we mentioned, as a look ahead, don't forget, for next week's episode, for Friday, right, we're going to have, a guest, KJ McDaniels, right, NBA player, right, also playing in the Philippines.
Hmm.
So look forward to that. So hopefully everybody has a great, great Monday, and I guess we'll see you at Friday.
Yes, sir.